Maybe you're a software engineer or someone whose job revolves around developing an application. If so, let me ask you this. When you build an application, what do you usually think about? Maybe you think about the product requirement, whether the application or the feature is usable for your users, or maybe you're thinking about the technical requirement, maybe what technology that you're going to use, or maybe how scalable and other limitation about the technology, right? And if you know this, you really think about security. Maybe for now, it's okay because we just want a product that works. But the consequences of ignoring security of your application may be dangerous because the stakes are your application, your system, your users' data, other available assets, or maybe even your company brand. And some of these are very hard to repair. Now, you may also think that, oh, I'm not a security expert. So, how can I prevent these problems relating to security? Well, let me introduce myself. I'm Shevalda, a software engineer at Horizon. We are an early stage startup where we're still building our products. And from my experience in building a new and legacy application, I find that software developers are good at developing applications because they have these guidelines in form of best practices, design patterns, or just general things to think about when you're building an application. And so I thought to myself, why don't we do the same thing for security? Why don't we start considering security when you're developing an application? Just think about it. If you're doing front end development, maybe it's thinking about browser compatibility, or maybe how your interface looks in different ratio and sizes. Or if you're a software developer who build mobile application, you may be thinking about the storage your app use or how performant your application in low spec devices. Or maybe you're a backend engineer who thinks about data design and the resiliency and the scalability of your services, right? And with that, maybe it's time for us to also think about security. And I would call this a security mindset. So let's start practicing these mindsets. Let's say we have an application called the market. In this application, you can find all kind of good products, right? And to find all the good products, you need a search function as shown here. So you might expect your user to input your product name, like for example, ice cream. But what if your user instead input this text? It is a script element that calls a JavaScript code. And as you can see here, your user input is shown in the page. Does your page just show the text as a text, or does it instead renders it as a script element and therefore run the JavaScript code? Also, what if your user input this kind of text? This is a kind of text that can manipulate your SQL query. Does your service able to handle this kind of text, or does it just follow whatever it is given? So another feature that your application might have is to show the details of your order. And usually the pattern for the URL is the resource name, in this case the orders, and then the ID of the resource. In this case, the order ID is 1. But again, what if your user noticed this and they input instead the order of 2, which is probably an order of another user that they shouldn't have access to. But when they access this, does your application prevent them from accessing it? Or does it show the user of the order? Another thing is that your application may have an admin page where the admin can see the orders of users. And let's say your admin page have a pattern of admin, order, and the ID of the order. If your user also tries to access this page, do they see an error page or do they have the same access as admin? And from these two examples, we can say that our users may have bad intentions. And this is very important to remember so that when you develop an application, you don't just naively accept whatever the user input. The next one. You might be familiar with this snippet. This code shows that the application is trying to connect to a MySQL database. And in this code, also, it is shown that the user and the password string is hard coded to the code. Now, you might be think that, oh, that's okay. Only our developer can see this configuration, right? Well, what if your developer is being hacked and the hacker stole the source code? Or what if your repository hosting application is hacked and somehow the hacker can make your private repository into a public one? And this is the second thing you have to think about is that your source code may be accessed by untrusted people. So you have to make sure that in your source code there is no secret that these people can use. So you might be also familiar with this command. This is a command where you try to access your database. In this case, a MySQL database. Do you see the problem here? Well, the first problem is that this database can be accessed by the default user, which is root. And the second problem is that this default user doesn't have a password. So basically, anyone who knows a bit about MySQL and knows the default user can access your database. And this can be very disastrous because there are so many valuable data that is stored in the database. And also another example is that in your application, you might use some logging, right? And in many programming language, there is usually one popular library for logging. In Java, log4j is the popular library for logging, right? And because it is so popular, it almost become the default logging that is used in the Java application. But if you haven't known, in the end of 21, there is a vulnerability that has been discovered in this log4j, and it causes a lot of headache for developers and companies because this vulnerability can cause very serious damage, right? And this becomes the next thing we have to remember is that a technology may have insecure default or it may have vulnerabilities. So next time when you are using a technology, try to research, are the default setting is secure, or do I need some additional configuration to make it secure? And also for the vulnerabilities, you have to make sure that you're updated with the news, right? If there is a new vulnerability that is discovered, you have to know to be able to mitigate it. So after all that, you may have also an internal system. Maybe it is a developer tool. Maybe it is a dashboard that is used by other departments. And have you ever asked yourself, do you use the same security measure for your internal system as you would in your user facing application? For example, let's say you have this login page. Do you use the same security validation, such as the password, as you would in your user registration? And also, you may have some different environment in your internal system. Maybe there is a sandbox, there's a staging, and then there is the production. Do you enforce that these credentials in different environment are not the same? Because let's say the credential for a sandbox is known to a responsible party. If it is used also in production, it may cause some unexpected things, and this irresponsible party can do some real damage to your system. And this is the last thing to remember is that internal system may be known to irresponsible parties. So you have to anticipate that and you should treat it as you would for a user facing application. So to wrap up things, there are four security mindsets you have to remember. The first one is that some of our users may have bad intention, so never blindly trust user inputs. Secondly, the source code may be accessed by untrusted people. And by this, you have to make sure that in your source code there is no secret that these people can use for exploitation. The third one is that technology may have insecure default or vulnerabilities. So next time you're using technology, make sure that you're using it in a safe configuration. And if it have some vulnerability, try to research how to mitigate it. Usually people are nice enough to share this kind of information. The fourth one is that internal system may be known to irresponsible parties. So you can't rely that your internal system will stay a secret to the employees of the company. You have to anticipate what if this internal system is known and exploited by irresponsible parties. Now, does all of this mindset covers everything about security? Well, unfortunately not, because security is a very broad domain and every day it evolves and there is always a new threat discovered. But there is this famous TV show in Indonesia that says that crime happens not only because there's an intention, but also an opportunity. And we, as a software engineer, is responsible to reduce that opportunity. And to reduce that, we have to start thinking about security. And that's all from me. If you have any questions, Let's connect through LinkedIn. And hopefully, after this, you start thinking about security next time you're developing an application. Thank you.